Admiral Ethankor stood before the colossal War Council table, the holographic map of the galaxy casting an eerie blue glow across his face. His hands, clasped tightly behind his back, betrayed none of the nerves he felt. His eyes, however, darted across the room, scanning the faces of the leaders from various factions, human and alien alike. They looked to him as their savior, but Kor wasn't so sure. The Varick Empire had surged across the galaxy like a storm, their brutal, unrelenting tactics wiping out entire systems. The coalition of planets, humanity's most powerful alliance, was on the brink of collapse. The war had dragged on for years, and every victory came at a high cost. Yet despite the setbacks, they had one hope left: Kor. The Admiral's reputation was legendary. His strategies, both brilliant and unorthodox, had saved countless worlds in the past. But Kor wasn't the same man who had once commanded fleets with confidence and ease. The loss of his family, his wife and daughter, during a failed campaign against a different enemy had shattered him. It had left him cold, distant, and unwilling to take on a leadership role ever again. But the Council of the Coalition had made their decision, and now Kor found himself standing at the helm of humanity's last hope. "You are the one who will lead us," said the voice of Chancellor Varen, the aging leader of the Coalition. His alien eyes were piercing, but they reflected an unspoken desperation. "We need you, Admiral. Your strategies are our only hope to turn the tide." Kor's throat tightened. His mind flashed back to the last time he had led, to the battle that cost him everything. He had been too arrogant, too sure of his own brilliance, and the consequences had been devastating. The Varick, a race of ruthless conquerors, were unlike anything he had faced before. Their relentless aggression, their sheer power, threatened to obliterate everything in its path. And now it was his turn to face them. Kor turned to the holographic map. The Vyrick forces had just decimated an entire human colony, one that had been the last defense before reaching Earth's core systems. The Varick Empire was pushing deeper into the Coalition's territory, and every day that passed saw another system fall. "We don't have time to debate this," Kor muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone in the room. He then raised his head, locking eyes with Varen. "Fine, I'll take command. But know this, if we fail, I'll take full responsibility." Varen nodded solemnly. "That is what a true leader does, Admiral. The fate of the galaxy rests in your hands." Kor felt the weight of those words more deeply than he cared to admit. The fleet was already on the move, assembling in the farthest reaches of the galaxy. But Kor wasn't just the commander of a fleet. He was a symbol now. A symbol that could either unite humanity and their allies or push them into utter chaos. As he stood at the center of the war room, he felt every eye on him. The Council had placed their trust in him, but the fleet, the soldiers, the officers, the civilians, hadn't. Many of them still saw him as a relic of the past. His first mission, his first test, would determine if they followed him or turned against him. His mind raced, strategizing on how to unite a fractured coalition, how to prepare for the coming storm. And then, from the silence of the war room, came a voice from behind the table. "We begin the assault tomorrow, Admiral. Are you ready?" Kor exhaled, his answer silent but resolute. The fight for survival had only just begun, and with the human spirit, fueled by desperation and an iron will, he would lead them, reluctantly. The first few days aboard the flagship Indomitable were tense. Kor's decision to assume command had been met with resistance from all corners of the fleet. Though his strategic brilliance was undisputed, his reputation as a leader was tarnished, and his sudden return to the front lines had only stirred doubts among his crew and officers. The coalition of planets, humans, and various alien races was fractured, and the wounds of past battles were still fresh. Kor sat in his command chair, staring at the holographic display of the fleet's movements. The fleet consisted of nearly 50 ships, human destroyers, alien battlecruisers, and even the massive Xthean war dreadnoughts, each an imposing symbol of their respective species. Their alliance had been born out of desperation, and as Kor observed them from the bridge, he could see the cracks already forming. Tensions between the factions were inevitable. The humans and the Shikor, a race of reptilian warriors, had never seen eye to eye. The Aldriths, an insectoid species, had their own motives, and the Thalirians, a peaceful race of scholars, were terrified of the war but unwilling to abandon their allies. It would take more than just military might to unite them. It would take trust, and Kor had none to offer. His first task as fleet commander was to meet with his senior officers and solidify the fragile unity within the ranks. Captain Talia Brack, a battle-hardened leader of the elite strike Team Alpha, was the first to challenge Kor's authority. She was everything Kor wasn't: confident, outspoken, and fiercely loyal to the mission, but also deeply skeptical of Kor's ability to unite the disparate factions of the fleet. "We don't need another strategist," Admiral Captain Brack said, her voice sharp as a blade. "We need someone who can make them follow you. You've spent years avoiding leadership. Now you're supposed to be their savior. How can we trust you?" Kor met her gaze, unblinking. He didn't flinch. "You're right. I'm not here to be their savior. I'm here to win this war, and if I have to make some hard choices along the way, I will." Brack stared at him for a long moment before speaking again, her tone softer this time. "I've seen what you can do on the battlefield, Kor, but leading a fleet is more than tactics. It's about trust, and you have none." The words stung, but Kor couldn't deny their truth. His reputation as a leader had crumbled the day his family was lost. Since then, he had kept his distance from the people he commanded, unwilling to risk the pain of another loss. But this was no longer about him. It was about the survival of every living being in the coalition. "You want trust," Kor said quietly, his voice carrying weight. "Then show me I can trust you. Help me prove to them that we can win this together." Brack hesitated, then nodded. "I'll follow you, Admiral, but don't think for a second I'll make it easy on you." As the fleet prepared for its first mission under Kor's command, an assault on a Vyric supply depot deep in enemy territory, the pressure mounted. The mission was dangerous, with no guarantee of success. If the fleet faltered, it could spell disaster for their fragile alliance. But Kor wasn't just fighting to win the battle. He was fighting to prove that he could lead again. The fleet set off in the dead of night, slipping past enemy patrols. The mission was high risk, but the reward could shift the balance of power in the war. As they neared the supply depot, Kor's eyes never left the display in front of him. His heart raced, not out of fear, but anticipation. He had trained for this. He had planned for it. But in the silence that hung over the bridge, Kor knew something else was at play, something he hadn't counted on. He wasn't just commanding a fleet. He was commanding a galaxy's worth of dreams, hopes, and fears. And if they failed here, the consequences would ripple far beyond this mission. The alarms blared. The Vyric had discovered their approach. Kor's fingers flew over the controls. "Brace for impact," he ordered, his voice calm but resolute. The first test had arrived. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but the fleet was. The sudden flash of red lights, followed by the deafening alarm, sent a surge of adrenaline through the bridge of the Indomitable. Kor's eyes darted to the tactical display, where the Vyric fleet had emerged from the shadows like a specter. They had been waiting, biding their time, knowing the human fleet couldn't sneak past them without detection. The odds were now stacked against them, but Kor wasn't one to retreat. "Status report." Kor barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've been spotted, Admiral." Lieutenant Rena Cad, the tactical officer, responded quickly. "Vyric ships are closing in fast. Their fleet's moving into intercept position." Kor's mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to hit the Vyric supply depot before they could even know they were there. But now the enemy had forced their hand, and the fleet was facing an all-out confrontation in deep space, far from any backup. Evasive maneuvers now, Kor ordered, his fingers flying over the command console. He had little time to think, only to act. The Indomitable shuddered as it veered sharply to the right, narrowly avoiding a barrage of plasma fire. But the Varric were relentless. Their fleet, sleek and menacing, loomed like a dark cloud of doom, each ship more menacing than the last. Captain Brack's voice cut through the tension. "Admiral, I suggest we deploy Strike Team Alpha to intercept their forward ships. We can't let them advance any further." "Do it," Kor replied. He trusted Brack's judgment implicitly, despite their earlier confrontations. She was capable, and this battle would demand every ounce of skill they had. As the Indomitable shuddered again from another impact, the battle unfolded in front of Kor. The human ships and their allies were fighting with everything they had, but they were outgunned, outnumbered, and overwhelmed by the sheer strength of the Varric. Kor's mind worked overtime, his calculations flowing faster than his crew could process. They needed to cripple the Varric flagship, and fast, but the enemy's countermeasures were sophisticated. They had expected this attack. "Launch the drones," Kor ordered, setting a plan into motion. The Indomitable's fleet deployed swarms of small, agile drones designed to hack into enemy systems. They wouldn't destroy the Varric ships directly, but they would create enough chaos to give them an opening. Brack's voice came through the comms again. "Strike Team Alpha is engaging the Varric cruisers. We've got a clear shot at their rear fleet. I suggest we take it." Kor nodded sharply. "All ships, focus fire on the Varric rear fleet. Take down their communications relay. We can't afford to let them call for reinforcements." The Indomitable unleashed a volley of plasma bolts, piercing through the enemy's defenses. The Varric flagship, a massive armored beast of a ship, remained unharmed in the center of the assault, its powerful shields absorbing everything thrown at it. Kor clenched his fists. They weren't going to win by brute force alone. He needed to outsmart them. In that moment, he made the call. "Prepare the Phoenix maneuver." Brack's voice crackled with disbelief. "Are you sure? That's a 1 in a million chance." "I don't need a million chances. I need one," Kor replied, his voice unwavering. "Now." The Phoenix maneuver was a high-risk tactic designed to create an opening by tricking the enemy sensors into thinking the fleet was retreating. It would leave the ships vulnerable for a split second, but if Kor timed it right, they could deliver a devastating blow. The fleet executed the maneuver flawlessly, simulating a retreat in the midst of the chaos. The Varric flagship, thinking they were about to gain the upper hand, pursued the human fleet, only to find themselves barreling into a trap. Kor had predicted their every move. As the Varric flagship entered the trap zone, Kor's fleet turned as one, unleashing everything they had. The Varric flagship's shields crackled under the assault, and for the first time, it faltered. "We've breached their shields," Lieutenant Cad shouted. "Captain Brack's team is in position to strike the heart of the ship." The Indomitable fired once more, a massive shot that ruptured the flagship's hull. The explosion lit up the void like a second sun. It was a Pyrrhic victory. Many of Kor's ships were badly damaged, and they had lost several good men. But they had struck a decisive blow. The Varric fleet was in disarray. Kor allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, but only a moment. He knew this was far from over. The Varric would regroup, and the cost of the battle was steep. "This is just the beginning," Kor muttered to himself, staring at the shattered remnants of the Varric flagship. It was a victory, but only the first of many battles they would need to win. The real test of their alliance, and his leadership, was yet to come. "Prepare for the next move," Kor ordered, his voice calm, but the fire of determination burned in his eyes. The victory over the Varric flagship was a fleeting triumph. Despite the heavy losses they had inflicted on the enemy, the cost to Kor's fleet had been immense. The Indomitable was scared, its hull riddled with plasma burns, and half of its weapon systems were offline. Many of the Allied ships weren't much better off, yet it was the unity of the fleet that had truly been tested. Kor stood on the bridge, watching the fractured fleet through the viewports. The stars outside seemed distant cold. He felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. Even in victory, there were too many lives lost, too many people counting on him to succeed. "Admiral," Captain Brack said, stepping up beside him, her face grim. "We've received reports from the Thalirians. They're requesting an emergency meeting." "The Thalirians?" Kor asked, turning to face her. "What's the issue?" "They're concerned about the escalation of this war," Brack explained, her voice laced with doubt. "They say we're crossing a line, that the human-led counteroffensive will only provoke the Varric further." Kor's eyes narrowed. The Thalirians had always been the most cautious of the coalition. A peaceful race, they were slow to engage in battle, preferring diplomacy and research to weapons and warfare. But now, with the Varric threatening the galaxy's core systems, there was no room for hesitation. "Tell them that they'll have to choose a side," Kor said coldly. "The war isn't going to wait for them to decide." Brack hesitated. "Admiral, I understand your frustration, but—" "I know what I'm doing, Captain," Kor interrupted, his tone firm. "We either stand together or we fall apart." She didn't argue further. Kor could see the concern in her eyes, the unspoken question. Would the alliance hold? He wasn't sure anymore. Every day, the fractures deepened, the differences between their species becoming more pronounced. And while the Varric were a common enemy, that wasn't enough to guarantee unity. The Thalirians weren't the only ones questioning the coalition's resolve. The Aldrits had grown increasingly vocal, accusing Kor of pushing them into battles they weren't prepared for. The Ixthians, too, were beginning to grumble, their leaders feeling the strain of prolonged combat. Kor knew he couldn't afford to lose them. If the factions broke apart now, the Varric would seize on their disarray and crush them all. But convincing them to stay unified was becoming an impossible task. Later that day, Kor convened an emergency summit in the fleet's command center. Representatives from each of the major factions assembled in tense silence. At the head of the table sat Kor, flanked by Captain Brack and the senior officers of the Indomitable. The room buzzed with a quiet anxiety, the air thick with unspoken fears. "We've come a long way," Kor began, his voice steady but laced with the weight of what was to come. "But we're not done yet. The Varric are relentless, and we can't afford to let this war fracture us. If we fail to unite, we'll fall, all of us." Chancellor Varen, the alien leader of the coalition, leaned forward, his aged face lined with worry. "And what do you suggest, Admiral? Do you think we can continue this war indefinitely? The losses are mounting. The people are afraid. I fear that we may have reached the point where our unity is a dream, not a reality." "We have to make it real," Kor shot back. "If we don't hold together, the Varric will destroy everything we fought for. And I don't know about you, but I'm not willing to let that happen." The Aldrith representative, a sleek insectoid diplomat named Vekla, hissed softly in protest. "You ask too much, Kor. You push us into battles we're not prepared for. The cost of victory is far too great." Kor's jaw clenched, but he remained composed. "Every battle comes with a cost, Vekla. And every day we delay, the Varric gets stronger. We can't afford hesitation." A murmur of discontent rippled through the room, but Kor's words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. "We need to strike at their heart," Kor continued, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "We hit their industrial worlds next, where they're building their warships. If we can cripple their production lines, we can turn the tide of this war." "The risk is immense," Brack warned. "But if we succeed, it could cripple the Varric's ability to wage war." A long silence followed. The factions exchanged looks, the decision weighing heavily on their collective conscience. In the end, it was the Thalirians who spoke up, their leader, Cyrith, rising from his seat. Admiral Kor is right. We may not be able to avoid more battles, but we cannot afford to falter now. If we pull back, we lose everything. The Thalirians, for all their hesitation, had finally thrown their lot in with Kor. One by one, the other leaders followed suit, agreeing to the next phase of the plan. The decision had been made. The coalition would press forward, risking everything for a chance at victory. But the trust that had been shattered in the past was still fragile, and every victory would now be measured not just in casualties, but in the strength of the alliances forged in fire. Kor stared at the holographic map before him. The battle for the Virix industrial core would be their greatest test yet. If they succeeded, they might just have a chance at winning this war. But if they failed, they would fracture beyond repair, and the galaxy would be lost. Let's make sure we don't fail, Kor muttered under his breath, his gaze cold with determination. It was time to take the fight to the Viric, and this time, there would be no turning back. The days leading up to the assault on the Viric industrial core were filled with a tense anticipation. Every faction in the coalition had put their differences aside, for now, to focus on the singular goal of crippling the Viric's war machine. But even with the alliance solidified, Kor could sense the undercurrent of doubt. The Thalirians, in particular, remained hesitant, their leader Cyrith's decision to support the strike weighing heavily on the race's collective conscience. Still, the fleet pressed forward, each ship brimming with resolve and quiet fear. Kor stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, his eyes locked on the vast expanse of space that stretched before him. The fleet was approaching the heart of the Viric Empire, an industrial world known as Orthis, a planet that produced the bulk of the Viric's warships and weapons. If they could destroy Orthis' production facilities, the Viric's ability to wage war would be severely diminished. The plan was risky, but it was the only real chance they had to turn the tide of the war. Admiral, we've entered the Orthis system, Lieutenant Cad's voice broke through Kor's thoughts. We're picking up Viric fleet movements. It's a heavy defensive presence. Kor's jaw tightened. They'll be expecting us. Prepare to move into formation, Captain Brack. Brack nodded from her station. Formations are ready. Strike Team Alpha is in position. Kor's gaze never wavered from the tactical display. He knew that once the battle began, there would be no turning back. The Viric were entrenched, and their fleets had already begun to mobilize in anticipation. It would be a brutal fight, but it was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. Commence the attack, Kor ordered, his voice carrying across the bridge. The fleet surged forward, its ships cutting through the darkness of space with deadly precision. The Viric had been expecting a full-on assault, but Kor had other plans. He had learned long ago that victory didn't always come from direct confrontation. Sometimes it came from misdirection. Deploy the decoys, Kor commanded. The fleet's hidden drones and false signals spread like a web, simulating multiple attack vectors. The Viric responded by scattering their defensive fleet, sending ships in all directions to intercept what they believed were multiple incoming strikes. It was a small victory in deception, but a critical one. With the Viric distracted, Kor's real forces moved in for the kill. Now, Kor muttered under his breath, his hand clenched tightly on the console. Strike Team Alpha, initiate the breach. Brack's voice was a swift, commanding reply. Strike Team Alpha engaging. We're in position to hit the shipyards directly. The Indomitable broke through the Viric defenses, its weapons firing in rapid succession as they carved a path toward the industrial heart of Orthis. The skies above the planet erupted with a storm of explosions as Allied ships followed in their wake, launching salvo after salvo into the enemy defenses. Kor watched with a cold determination as enemy ships began to fall. But as the Viric flagship, the Regent's Fury, turned its massive guns toward them, Kor's pulse quickened. The ship was the cornerstone of their military power, and it was now bearing down on them with overwhelming force. This isn't good, Captain Brack said, her voice tight. The Regent's Fury is targeting us directly. We need to disable its weapon systems, or we'll never get through. Kor's mind raced. He had no illusions about the strength of the Regent's Fury. It was a juggernaut of a ship, heavily armored, with an arsenal that could wipe out entire fleets. If they didn't act quickly, it could decimate the entire coalition. "We're going to hit them where it hurts," Kor said, his voice cold with purpose. "Target their engines. If we take them out, we can cripple their command structure." The crew sprang into action, firing at the Regent's Fury's rear engines. A powerful explosion rocked the flagship, sending a shockwave through space. But the Varric flagship remained operational, its shields still holding strong. "We're not going to stop them like this," Brack said, frustration clear in her voice. "We need a more direct approach." Kor's mind raced again, searching for a solution. He looked at the tactical map, his eyes narrowing. "Captain, set us up for a high-speed run. Full power to the engines. I'll take a team aboard the Regent's Fury. We'll disable their core from the inside." Brack's eyes widened in disbelief. "You want to board their flagship? Do you have a better idea?" Kor snapped. Brack hesitated for a moment, but then her eyes met his. She saw the conviction in his gaze. "I'll make sure the fleet covers your entry." Kor stood, a grim determination settling over him. This was the moment of truth. He wasn't just commanding a fleet anymore. He was leading an assault that could shift the balance of the entire war. Within minutes, Kor and his team were suited up, preparing to board the enemy flagship. The Indomitable made its high-speed run, weaving through enemy fire as it locked onto the Regent's Fury. As the breech doors opened, Kor's heart pounded in his chest, and he gave one final glance to the chaos unfolding outside. "Let's finish this," he muttered, before stepping into the unknown. The battle for Orthis was far from over, but Kor had made his choice. There would be no retreat now. The fate of the coalition, and the war, depended on what happened next. Kor's boots thudded heavily on the metallic floor of the Regent's Fury, the rumbling of the ship's engines vibrating through the hull. His team, a mixture of human and alien soldiers, followed closely behind, their movements precise and coordinated. The blast doors sealed shut behind them, cutting off their connection to the outside world. They were now alone in the heart of the Varric flagship. "Admiral," Captain Brack's voice crackled through his comms. "You've got a small window. We've got Varric reinforcements incoming, and the rest of the fleet is holding as best they can. But this can't take long." Kor nodded, though he knew she couldn't see it. The pressure of the mission weighed on him, but it was a pressure he had become familiar with. He was the one who had steered them into this battle, and now it was his responsibility to see it through. The interior of the Regent's Fury was eerily quiet, save for the steady hum of its operations. The Varric ships, despite their brutal warlike nature, were models of cold efficiency. The corridors were lined with sharp angles and harsh lighting, giving the ship the feel of a massive, impenetrable fortress. Kor and his team advanced swiftly, keeping to the shadows, their weapons raised and ready. They had trained for this moment. Every soldier knew the importance of staying hidden, of striking when the moment was right. "We're approaching the central core," Kor whispered into his comm, signaling to his team to slow their pace. "Stay sharp. We don't know how deep their defenses go." As they crept deeper into the heart of the ship, the tension in the air grew thicker. The Varric weren't known for subtlety, but their military hierarchy was well organized, and it was clear that Kor's team had to neutralize the core's defenses before they could access the ship's command systems. A sharp metallic screech echoed down the corridor, followed by the sound of footsteps. Kor held up his fist, signaling his team to stop. He motioned for two of the soldiers to take cover at either side of the corridor. Through the narrow passage, a Varric soldier, heavily armored and carrying a long-range plasma rifle, came into view. The creature's reptilian eyes scanned the hull, and it stopped a mere meter from where Kor's team was hidden. Time seemed to stretch as Kor's heart pounded. The soldier's helmeted gaze passed just inches from where they crouched, but he didn't spot them. The team held their breath, every muscle tensed, until a Varric soldier finally turned and moved past them, unaware of the danger so close. Kor gave a quick signal, and the team silently continued moving forward, now more cautious than ever. Every corner, every door, could lead to another deadly encounter. After what seemed like hours, they finally arrived at the heart of the Regent's fury. A massive chamber stretched before them, its walls pulsating with energy. In the center of the room, the Varric's core, a glowing, unstable energy core that powered the entire ship, stood encased in a lattice of protective beams and security grids. "This is it," Kor said under his breath, his voice low and urgent. "We need to breach those shields and plant the charges." The core was heavily guarded. Varric soldiers stood in clusters around the perimeter, monitoring the fluctuating energy readouts from consoles that lined the walls. The proximity sensors, barely a few meters away, would detect any intruder who got too close. Kor didn't hesitate. He nodded to his team, and with a synchronized motion, they activated their cloaking devices, rendering themselves invisible to the naked eye. They moved like shadows, inching toward the edge of the chamber, avoiding detection. One soldier, a sharp-eyed Ixthian named Collar, reached the first set of consoles, silently disabling the external alarms with a few swift, practiced motions. Kor's breath caught in his throat as the familiar hum of the system died down, the detection grid now deactivated. They had a small window. Kor motioned for the demolition team to advance. The charges were small, but powerful enough to overload the core and destabilize the entire ship. Their mission was clear. They had to destroy the ship's energy center to render it useless and cripple the Regent's fury. But as Kor moved toward the core's central chamber, a sudden hiss echoed through the room, and the Varric soldiers stopped. Their eyes widened, scanning the area, their instincts finally catching on to the presence of intruders. "Damn it," Kor muttered, pulling his blaster from its holster. "It's now or never." A firefight erupted in an instant. The Varric soldiers, alerted to their presence, opened fire with deadly precision. The team responded quickly, the alien weapons firing in unison as they neutralized the guards one by one. But the clock was ticking. Every second counted. "Kor," Brack's voice came through his earpiece, sharp and urgent. "We've got incoming. You need to finish it now or—" A violent explosion rattled the ship as the charge was detonated. Kor felt the energy pulse through the chamber, his heart racing as the core began to flicker, sparks flying in all directions. "It's done," Kor said, breathing heavily as he turned to his team. "Let's get the hell out of here." The energy core sputtered, the glowing light dimming as the ship's power began to collapse. The Regent's fury was crippled, its once unyielding grip on the fleet now shattered. But the battle was far from over. Now they had to escape before the ship went down. "Move, move, move," Kor shouted, his team breaking into a sprint as the walls trembled, the ship beginning to disintegrate around them. The Regent's fury was dying, but so was the Varric's war effort. For the first time in a long while, Kor felt the weight of hope press into his chest. This fight could be won, but at what cost, and would it be enough? The corridors of the Regent's fury shook violently as explosions tore through the ship's guts, the energy core now in a rapid cascade of instability. Kor and his team sprinted through the halls, weaving between flickering lights and shaking metal. The sound of alarms blared overhead, a cacophony that threatened to drown out his thoughts. Each step felt like an eternity, the adrenaline fueling him as much as it weighed him down. "Keep moving," Kor shouted, his voice grim but steady. His team followed closely behind, their movements quick and determined. They had a narrow window, too narrow to waste. If they didn't reach the hangar in time, they would be trapped on a dying ship. Kor's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. The mission was a success. The Varric flagship was crippled. The core had been destroyed. But the victory had come at a cost. Their escape was now a race against time. The Regent's Fury was already losing power, its systems flickering and shutting down in rapid succession. "We're almost there," Collar called out from the front, his voice tight with urgency. "Just a few more hauls to go." Kor nodded, his eyes scanning the path ahead, anticipating any Varric reinforcements that might appear. The ship was on the verge of collapse, but the Varric were relentless. They would fight to the last, no matter the odds. He wasn't sure how long they could hold off the enemy before their escape route was cut off. As they neared the hangar, an explosion rocked the hull just ahead of them. The shockwave knocked them off balance, sending them crashing to the floor. The blast sent debris flying, but Kor quickly pushed himself back up, his mind racing. "Report," he barked, his voice cold. "We've been cut off," Brack responded. "The main corridors collapsed. We'll need to find another way." Kor's jaw tightened. They had no time to waste. The ship's structural integrity was failing, and the Varric forces were closing in. He scanned the surrounding area, his eyes narrowing as he looked for any alternate routes. A flickering emergency light caught his attention, an access shaft to the side, barely visible in the chaos. "Over there," Kor pointed. "Through that shaft, it should lead to the hangar." His team didn't hesitate. They sprinted toward the shaft, the sound of Varric boots echoing in the distance, growing louder. Kor didn't wait to see if they were being pursued. He was already moving, crawling through the narrow opening, his soldiers following suit. The shaft was cramped, its walls lined with cables and exposed pipes that seemed to pulse with the dying energy of the ship. The temperature inside was rising as the ship's cooling systems failed. Sweat poured down Kor's face, but he didn't falter. They were so close. "We've got to move faster," Collar called out, his voice strained. Kor didn't need to hear it twice. "Push ahead. We don't stop until we're in the hangar." The heat was oppressive now, the air thick with the smell of burning metal. The shaft twisted and turned, but Kor's focus never wavered. Every corner brought them closer to their goal, and the closer they got, the more desperate the Varric became. Gunfire echoed through the narrow passages behind them, the Varric desperate to prevent their escape. "We're almost there," Brack shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Kor's heart raced. They were so close. One last turn, and they would be free. Then the explosion came. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound that reverberated through every surface. A blast from behind threw Kor off his feet, sending him crashing into the wall of the shaft. His head spun, and for a moment he thought he might black out. But there was no time for that. "Kor," Brack's voice, sharp and panicked, pierced through the fog in his mind. "We need to move. Now." Shaking off the dizziness, Kor pushed himself up. His vision was blurry, but he forced himself to focus. The ship was dying. They had no time to waste. "Go, go, go," he shouted, his voice ragged but fierce. The team scrambled through the final stretch of the shaft, emerging into the hangar just as the entire ship seemed to tremble in its death throes. Kor's eyes scanned the room, landing on the fleet of shuttles parked against the far wall, their only hope of survival. He rushed toward one of the closest shuttles, signaling for the rest of his team to follow. The cockpit door hissed open, and Kor slid into the seat, his hands moving automatically to power up the systems. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and he felt a surge of relief, but it was brief. "Brack, Collar, get in," Kor barked, watching as the rest of the team scrambled aboard. The hangar doors had already begun to close, the ship's systems slowly failing, but they still had a chance to make it. The shuttle's engines screamed as they powered forward, pushing through the opening just as the Regent's Fury's collapse began in earnest. The blast from the ship's destruction rocked the shuttle, throwing it into a violent spin. Kor's vision blurred as he fought to regain control, his hand slamming against the stabilizers to correct the ship's trajectory. "We're clear," Brack shouted as they broke through the wreckage of the dying ship, the stars outside their view shifting and spinning. Kor let out a long, slow breath, his grip on the controls tightening as they pulled away. The Regent's fury was no more. The battle for Orthis had been won. But as the shuttle shot into the darkness of space, Kor knew that this was just one victory in a war that was far from over. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Kor felt the faintest stirrings of hope. The stars stretched out before them, a vast ocean of possibilities. But Kor's mind was far from the beauty of the cosmos. He sat in the shuttle's cockpit, his hands steady on the controls, but his thoughts were miles away, caught in the storm of the battle they had just won. The Regent's fury had been a formidable enemy, a symbol of the Varric's unrelenting power. Its destruction was a major blow to their war machine, but Kor knew the Varric wouldn't stop. They would rebuild, they would retaliate. But for the first time in weeks, Kor allowed himself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of their success. The mission was complete. The fleet was still intact, and they had returned alive. Behind him, the rest of the team had settled in, their faces worn but triumphant. The shuttle's cabin was filled with the soft hum of the engine and the occasional clink of armor being readjusted. It was a strange, quiet celebration. Their work wasn't done, but for now, they could afford a brief moment of peace. Kor, Brack's voice broke the silence. Her tone was steady but laced with exhaustion. "We've made it. But I need to know, what now?" He turned slightly, meeting her gaze in the rearview mirror. The captain's face was lined with fatigue, but there was a fire in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. Kor admired that. "What now?" he repeated as if tasting the words. "We rebuild, we train, we prepare." Brack nodded, her expression thoughtful, and the Varric. "They'll regroup," Kor said, his voice hardening. "But we've struck a blow that they won't recover from easily. We've bought ourselves time." "Time for what?" Collar, sitting beside Brack, asked. His voice was quiet, almost reflective. "Time to strike back. Time to win this war," Kor replied, his gaze steady as he looked out into the black expanse of space. The shuttle continued its course toward the fleet's rally point, a safe zone on the edge of the Orthis system. The rest of the fleet, their allies from various corners of the galaxy, were already waiting. The victory at Orthis had shaken the Varric, but it was only the beginning of what would be a long and grueling war. As the shuttle neared the rendezvous point, Kor's thoughts drifted again, this time to his crew, his soldiers. They were the heart of this campaign. It wasn't just his leadership that had brought them this far. It was their relentless will, their bravery, their sacrifices. They were the ones who would carry the fight to the Varric, who would press forward when all seemed lost. "Kor," Brack said again, pulling him from his thoughts. "You've led us through hell. You were the right choice, but I know it's been hard. How are you holding up?" Kor looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the weight of it all. He had been the reluctant commander, forced into a role he never wanted. But as he saw the faces of his soldiers, his friends, he knew that he couldn't let them down. Not now, not ever. "I'm holding up," Kor replied, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I couldn't do this alone." There was a brief pause, and then Brack smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "None of us could." The shuttle docked with the fleet, and the doors hissed open to the bustle of activity beyond. Soldiers moved with purpose, engineers checked systems, and medics tended to the injured. The fleet was alive, pulsing with the energy of victory, but there was no time to relax. Kor stood from the cockpit, moving toward the exit. He felt the weight of his role on his shoulders, but it was no longer the burden it once was. He had found his purpose. His team was behind him, and together they were unstoppable. Brack followed him, her steps echoing in the hallway. "What's next?" Kor's eyes narrowed as he looked out the viewport. The stars were still endless, their light distant and cold. But there was a promise in that coldness, a reminder that there was always a new challenge ahead. "We fight," Kor said, his voice unwavering. We fight until the Varric are nothing but a memory, and then we rebuild." They were standing on the precipice of a new dawn, a galaxy that had been shaken to its core. The Varric were still a threat, but now humanity and its allies had proven that they could stand up to anything. The war was far from over, but for the first time, Kor allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The future was uncertain, but they were ready to face it. Together. "Ready for the next fight, Commander?" Brack asked, her tone light but with a spark of seriousness underneath. Kor looked at her, meeting her gaze. "Always." And with that, they stepped into the future, ready to carve their place in the stars.